So, Erwin, David, NSF obviously has a huge role to play in the quantum R&D ecosystem, everything from fundamental research all the way to the translational piece. So I was hoping you could tell us more about what each of you do, what the broad scope of NSF's remit really is.
Right, thanks very much. Hopefully you can hear us. So this is our 75th anniversary at the National Science Foundation. Yes, founded right after World War II, 1950. Vannevar Bush's vision that it would be important post-war for us to really invest in fundamental science with really a broad mission space. We're sort of not the mission agency, but the science agency, where it boils down to the science. But we've transitioned under the leadership of Setharaman Panchanathan into a 7-directorate agency into an 8-directorate agency with the emergence of TIP, the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate that my colleague Erwin Gianchandani leads. I lead the Mathematical and Physical Sciences Directorate, so that encompasses physics, chemistry, math, sort of the core bedrock of where most of us would start our investigations, including in the quantum space. Of course, there's an important SCIES directorate, computer science and engineering, an important directorate in engineering space, and we collaborate closely with them. And now there's an EDU directorate. It had a different name before, but it's easier to remember now, EDU, and we collaborate with them on the educational space. Out of chemistry, physics, and math, we have sort of the fundamental core research project all the way from individual investigator grants into partnerships. That's something we call TACs, which are smaller group collaborations, all the way up to center level funding in things like the Centers for Chemical Innovation, the Materials Research and Engineering Centers, or MERSECs, the Physics Frontier Center. So those are our traditional centers, up to the new, really, infusion of capital into quantum-focused basic research at the center level, which kind of inaugurated under France Cordova when she was the previous director, when the quantum leap was one of the big ideas that France Cordova put forward, and that has morphed into quantum information science and technology, where we are today, and we have the Quantum Leap Challenge Institutes, and those are sort of our marquee investments at center-level research focused on the quantum revolution. And I may say a little bit more later, but I'd like to turn to my colleague Erwin to transition over.
Sure, thanks, Dave. So I think that if there's one thing you take away from this conversation, some of you may know NSF, some of you may know the mission space for NSF, as Dave articulated, for 75 years, really the agency that helps to sort of crystallize the frontiers of science all across the landscape, from bio to computing to math and physical sciences and beyond. I think the important point that I'd love to leave you all with at the end of this conversation is that it's really, I think, an ecosystem approach that we try to take at NSF. We support the fundamentals, as Dave articulated, out of his directorate and others across the agency. Increasingly, we also support the translational aspects as well. So how do we take some of the great innovations in the labs, and how do we bring them into the market space? We were the first agency in the federal government with an SBIR program, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, back in the 1970s and 1980s, piloted that for the rest of the federal government. Today now, almost a dozen agencies that invest in R&D invest in an SBIR component of that R&D. In just the last few years, we've invested about $1.6 billion in SBIRs out of NSF. That $1.6 billion has turned into more than $32 billion in follow-on investment by VCs, angel investors, private sector capital, private capital, and so forth. So that's more than a 16-to-1 return on investment. I'd love to see my colleagues across government challenge that return on investment. But I think that's meant to sort of illustrate, I think, that we have a very fundamental role here, from the foundations to the more use-inspired to the more translational work. We also are increasingly the agency in the government that really supports, as Dave articulated, the education and workforce development dimensions, from K-12 on up to people who are in the workforce today looking to pivot into quantum because they're so interested in what's happening in this space, for example. And then we care a lot about the infrastructure. what are the research resources, what are the workforce building resources that are necessary to be able to help support the R&D and the talent creation and cultivation that we want to see happen. So, for example, in the last year, we have really blazed a path around something that we call the National Quantum Virtual Laboratory, NQVL, where the objective is to try to be able to position a set of assets, a set of resources for academics, for a whole host of folks to be able to sort of start to get their hands dirty, if you will, test out new research outputs, pilot, prototype, try to get to a place where we can have a better understanding of some of those initial steps that are necessary to harden and mature technology and start to move it up the technology readiness levels, if you will, out of the lab and into the market space. So those are sort of our 4 areas: fundamentals, translational, workforce development, and also thinking a lot about the infrastructure that enables all of that. And I'll just say that at a high level, I think this aligns very strongly with what the White House is focused on, what this administration is focused on. Michael Kratsios, I know, gave some virtual remarks here yesterday. He talked about the administration's 5 pillars when it comes to advancing the frontiers of quantum and quantum information science and quantum technology. And those 5 pillars range from growing the quantum workforce to pushing breakthroughs out of the lab and into the market, to thinking about how do we incentivize the ecosystems that produce quantum innovations and quantum technologies. One of the seminal programs of my directorate at NSF, for instance, in the last few years has been something that we call the Regional Innovation Engines, or the NSF Engines program, where we're trying to cultivate regional growth, help regions across the country become the next clusters, the next hubs, if you will, of technology. So just like we have Silicon Valley and we have Kendall Square in Boston, how do we help position Kansas City and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Osceola County, Florida, every corner of this country to be a leader, depending on what is natural for them given their backyard secret sauce? So that was his 3rd priority. And then I think Dave can talk more about this, but developing strong international partnerships, as well as thinking about how do we protect the research that we're enabling as well. How are we sensitive to IP, export control provisions, and so on. So I think that if you look at those 5 pillars of the administration, there's a very much a one-to-one alignment between those pillars and the efforts that we care a lot about at NSF and the work that we're promulgating at NSF as well.
Yeah, so if I could riff on that a little bit, Erwin talked about the NQVL, and he also talked about the engines as putting together, really crystallizing collaborative teams in areas that begin to implement really fundamental QIS discoveries into practice. I wanted to highlight a little bit of the themes that our Quantum Leap Challenge Institutes are centered around. I know there are a lot of people interested in quantum computing. At this particular meeting, we had a special event last night, again, hosted by the ambassador from the Netherlands, and we saw a lot of international interest, of course, in this as well. And the theme from that meeting, or that gathering last night, was "Together we will be stronger," and there's certainly interest in international, in the quantum computing space. But we have the robust simulation, QLCI, that's here, centered in Maryland, not too far away, and there's a nice ecosystem. It's maybe centered at the University of Maryland, but takes advantage of Johns Hopkins University, the Advanced Physics Lab there, and also even Morgan State University. So it's quite, and it's part of the DMV. And the DMV has not just the federal government, but a growing ecosystem in this space. That's complemented by the Challenge Institute for Quantum Computing on the other coast, that's centered at UC Berkeley. And of the 5 QLCIs that we have, those 2 sort of pushing the envelope in the platform development, algorithm development, quantum error correction around the quantum computing enterprise. And I think that makes for a very powerful portfolio in that space. Quantum sensing, of course, is maybe even closer to implementation, depending on the application. We have a really interesting one, sort of 2 different ones in this space. QSense is more on the metrology, quantum clocks area, centered in Colorado with some NIST involvement. But then we have one called Cube, which is out of the University of Chicago, which is more focused on quantum sensing in complex systems such as biology, really focused on biology. And it has helped, I think, to nucleate an ecosystem there around it Chan Zuckerberg has recently built a new biohub in the Chicago metro, and quantum sensing and biological systems being the theme of CUBE, I'm sure was one of the nucleating points there. NSF also just launched a National Institute for Theory in Math and Biology. That's a major investment. Northwestern University leads that. University of Chicago is involved, and they're sitting in the John Hancock building there in Chicago. So there's a really interesting ecosystem around quantum that I see as being partially nucleated by that CUBE quantum sensing center that we put in there. Of course, there's also state money now going in with the governor of Illinois wanting to also invest in that space. And then in the quantum networks area, staying in Illinois but moving a bit downstate, we have the HOAN, which is the Hybrid Quantum Architectures and Networks, QLCI, centered at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So that makes for a really nice portfolio. Now, those started in 2020, and they've run their course and made really remarkable contributions over their 5-year run. They're now up for renewal and in competition with others. So we're in the middle of that right now, the QLCI recompetition, and we hope to be able to expand the space of what we can do here. A lot of this was fueled not just by NSF's ideas, of course, but by a national quantum initiative that Congress put forward under Trump 45, and that is also being discussed for reauthorization right now. So these are areas we're following with great interest, given what Erwin just pointed out about the White House and Michael Kratsios's prioritization of QIST. We're hopeful that, and from indications we get, it seems that there's bipartisan support also in Congress for this. So we're hopeful that there will be a National Quantum Initiative reauthorization, and that we'll be able to continue to invest in this type of center investment, which is both fundamental and naturally transitions over to Erwin's shop for our collaborative work at the NQVL space. And maybe I'll pass it back to Erwin for some thoughts.
Yeah, and then I think maybe we can open it up for questions in the room as well. I think one of the things that, maybe two things that I'll highlight, riffing off of Dave's comments. One is we're really interested in trying to be able to understand in those regions that Dave just talked about, but really across the country, what are the leverage points that we have? What are the opportunity spaces that we should really be thinking about to be on the bleeding edge when it comes to quantum? And I think we have invested pretty heavily in the foundations, and now increasingly more in the use-inspired aspects. I think one of the things that we are especially excited about is this intersection of quantum plus X, where X could be a discipline of science like chemistry or biology. How might we bring quantum computing, quantum sensing capabilities to bear in those domains to further the understanding in those fields, while at the same time also being sure that we're furthering the innovation in quantum as well. But at the same time, I think the plus X the plus X dimension sort of traverses to other domains, other sectors of the economy as well. Even at this conference, I think there's been a lot of discussion about quantum in the context of the finance sector, or quantum in the context of healthcare. We've seen, for example, IBM invest pretty heavily together with the Cleveland Clinic in the deployment of one of their quantum systems for healthcare innovation at the Cleveland Clinic. And so I think that's just sort of at the tip of the sphere, if you will. I think there's a lot more work that potential that exists to be advanced in that space. And so for us, as we think about in the context of the various investments that we just characterized for you, talking about the basics to more translational, thinking about the workforce of today and tomorrow, thinking about the infrastructure to be able to make all of that happen. And the Quantum Leap Challenge Institutes being, I think, our flagship effort. Also, NQVL, National Quantum Virtual Laboratory, is another flagship effort. I think we're also trying to think through what are the key questions that we are primed to be able to address in the quantum space in the short to medium term that requires investment by NSF together with the private sector to really drive inroads in this space. And so I think for us, our questions are, how do we work with the private sector to bring some of the research to bear on how do we build useful quantum computers, right? I mean, it's great to be talking about qubits, 15 qubits, 20 qubits, 100 qubits, and so forth, but you need to reimagine the entire computing stack. and that requires a significant amount of R&D to be able to really drive that forward. Everything from, the compilers to the algorithms to the software packages to the networking layer, and the whole computing stack needing to be re-architected. I think a second question that we're asking is, how do we develop those applications? What's that nexus between quantum and X, where X might be a domain, might be a field, might be a sector of the economy? And then relatedly, I think there are a whole host of disciplines and fields that stand to benefit from even more precise quantum sensing capabilities going forward. And so how do we optimize that? How do we make sense of superpositioning and entanglement and some of the challenges that we have to get to steady state in a particular context? How do we optimize our sensing capabilities as we go forward? That has applications in neuromedicine. It has applications in positioning systems and networks and so forth as we move forward. So I think, again, if you take some things away from this conversation, we're aiming to do this as a fireside chat. It's really about an ecosystem approach with sort of those four thrusts: foundations, translations, thinking about workforce development, thinking about the infrastructure, and then also what are some of the questions that we see at the tip of the sphere. And all of this, I think, is in very strong alignment with the administration and congressional priorities.
And I'd just like to add, before we throw it open, this idea of ecosystem building and partnerships is so important to the approach that we're trying to take. There's something like 46 companies, some startups, some larger, that are associated with those 5 QLCIs that I mentioned a moment ago. Of course, there are a lot of companies represented here at this meeting. And how do we optimize, as Erwin said, the partnership with the private sector on the one hand, but also think about reimagine partnerships with other federal agencies, DOE, even NIH, are agencies we talk to all the time, of course NIST, of course DOD as well. They're very important applications there. How do we partner with philanthropic interest in this space, which is growing? And that's a potentially, the new normal. What's the new normal mechanism for funding the most competitive and wide, far-reaching research in this country? And I think diversifying your funding portfolio is something that is coming to the fore, and we can help with that the more that we are able to partner. But the other type of partnership would be international partnership, and that's another thing that I think Michael Kratsios mentioned in his remarks to you yesterday. And I wanted to highlight that just today, if you Google it, you'll see an announcement made associated with the President's state visit to the United Kingdom, that the NSF and the UKRI are announcing a call for center-to-center proposals, supplements to facilitate centers like our QLCIs partnering with their counterparts in the United Kingdom. And that's hot off the presses, so I invite you to take a look at that. And I wanted to also mention in this Quantum Plus X that Erwin just introduced, that so my previous job, I was leading the chemistry division at the National Science Foundation for the last 4 years, and one of our efforts was to brainstorm with our colleagues at the United Kingdom about what would be an area where we could do something really special and synergistic, and it ended up being quantum plus chemistry, and looking for non-traditional, if there is a traditional quantum system, even less traditional ones than the platforms that are being explored now. And that led to a joint call, a joint workshop, a joint call. Those awards will be announced tomorrow, so keep your eyes open for that, the very first set of awards in the joint NSF-UKRI competition in novel approaches to quantum systems in chemistry.
Awesome. So if you have questions, please let me know. But I'm going to take my prerogative as the chair to ask the first question, which is, could you talk a little bit more about on the back end, kind of the interplay between your two divisions? So how do the QLCIs, the STCs, the MRSACs, the ERCs, clearly there's been a drumbeat coming from NSF about translation and transition across the spectrum. But how are you working with TIP? How is TIP sort of gleaning the opportunities and the exciting innovation and helping to transition that?
I mean, I'll start by saying, without saying too much, within the agency, ever since quantum has been a priority, really since France Cordova called it out, we have mobilized. What we think is perhaps our biggest strength at NSF is the broad swath of scientific space that we cover, right? So I mentioned a number of these directorates earlier. We also have the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, and economics is relevant here as well. So we have a steering committee within the agency that our representatives from our directorates co-chair, and we have a regular dialogue within the agency, which facilitates making sure that ideas we have or innovations we see coming from the QLCIs, that information comes to TIP, and that in the opposite direction, we hear about a convening that TIP has with maybe using the QEDC, right, the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, that's so effective in bringing together people. Maybe turn to Erwin for his thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I appreciate you asking the question. I mean, I think that when we first established the TIP Directorate, one of the first concerns, if you will, from the community was, is this going to rob Peter to pay for Paul? Are we going to run into a situation where, TIP is going to start to tread into the space of budget that the other directorates have? And I think that at the end of the day, one has to realize that you can't really have the work that we do in TIP to bring ideas out of the lab and into the market space unless you have the labs and you have some of that R&D that's taking place. And that's what my colleagues like Dave across the foundation are promulgating through the work that they're supporting. And there's shades of gray here. I mean, there's some translational work that happens organically in the research projects that Dave's shop might fund, and there's some interesting foundational discovery work that has yet to happen even when we inherit a project in TIP to be able to drive it forward. But I think that we're really interested in trying to, I talk about the TIP Directorate as a vehicle for trying to help fill that gap between lab and market. It's often called the valley of death, but I don't think there's one valley. I think there's actually many divots along the way, many micro valleys along the way. And so what we need to do is understand, how do we pick up an output coming out of a QLCI, for instance, and how do we help that team really gain that entrepreneurial exposure, gain that really skill set. It's a different skill set. If you're a faculty member, even with all due respect, or you're a student, to be thinking now about what's the market. What's the customer discovery that I need to do? How do I really develop a business plan even? What's the further research that needs to happen to harden the technology and mature the technology to a point where I've been able to provably demonstrate that it's viable in a variety of different settings and contexts? And so that is where I think our work comes to bear, and that's where we have a suite of investments from our SBIR program to we recently launched Translation to Practice, TTP, as an effort to try to meet researchers where they are in their discovery to innovation evolution, if you will, to thinking about as well, I think, new concepts that we have. So for instance, we just in the last few weeks launched an effort called Programmable Cloud Labs, PCLs, where the idea is to try to help automate some of the science that's taking place in research labs, help sort of this virtuous cycle, if you will, of, okay, I have some ideas, I have a hypothesis, let me go off and test that hypothesis in a lab environment, let me get some results from that hypothesis testing, let me now analyze those results and then repeat that process over again. Well, there are ways in which we might be able to automate that, to obviously with humans still in the loop, with researchers still in the loop, so that we have researchers focusing more on the higher order bits as opposed to thinking about sort of the nitty gritty of, okay, let me do a pipetting experiment here if it's organic chemistry, for example, and quantum meeting organic chemistry. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity potential there, and our efforts in TIP are to see how can we effectively partner. How can we effectively build the infrastructure, the test beds, the resources, and then how can we provide that entrepreneurial education and training as well to really facilitate the translational activities that we want to see happen.
Awesome, thank you. So I think we will have time for at least one question.
Thank you. My name is Krishna, I'm Director of AI and Quantum. We're a small business company, expert at infotech. My question is, because yesterday in the same place, we saw a report wherein US spent around $1 billion, but China spent around $15 billion worth of on quantum. So especially with the National Quantum Reauthorization, right? Is NSF giving any input to that to increase the budget and all, and also in terms of Q plus X, right? Right now there are only few use cases we see coming up, but in order to sprinkle that more, to kind of start up that Q plus X capabilities in the system, what are the approaches you are thinking? Of course, NQI is one approach. Are there any other approaches you're thinking?
So I'm happy to start. Dave, I'm sure we'll have additional thoughts here. So first, I think one of our roles as an agency is to provide what we call technical assistance to the Hill anytime they're contemplating legislation. And so we're not going to, we're not in an advocacy role by any means. That's not our role because we're part of the federal government. So we might not say, you should authorize at these levels in terms of dollars. But what we can say is we can offer technical expertise with regard to, does this approach potentially work? Does this mechanism work? And if we were to run this mechanism to support innovations in quantum, this is how much it might cost, right? And then it's up for the authorizers and the appropriators to decide how best to pursue that. That's one comment. Second comment that I'll make is, I think we do have a role in trying to be able to coalesce that cross-sectoral ecosystem. So for example, later this fall, we intend to convene other agencies together with NSF, together with the private sector, including startups and small businesses, to really think about what's the coalition of the willing to help us identify the various plus X's, the various use cases, to help us identify the next set of research questions, and how might we work together around those as well.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, we're always available to folks on the Hill, and it has happened where both of us together will provide technical advice or consultation to staffers from folks on the Hill who are reaching out to us to want to, and that's great when that happens, and hopefully that helps to infuse good information and ideas into that debate on the quantum National Quantum Initiative reauthorization. I wanted to give one example of, getting industry involved in the conversation is good too. We very much welcome that. What are the frontiers? What does industry see? And can we work together? And an area that's more in the AI than the quantum space that Erwin and I end up working very closely together on is something that we call MFS SPEED, Molecular Foundations for Sustainability and Sustainable Polymers Through Emerging Data Analytics. So it's about a digital thread when you're thinking about designing polymers. And this emerged out of a special workshop where we invited leading chemical industry representatives from around the country. And it ended up being companies like Procter & Gamble and Dow and BASF that were able to coalesce around a theme that also resonated with us. And that led to a true partnership. They actually co-invested with us. They leveraged their investment. They de-risked some high-risk research. And the first awards have been made, and they were involved in the process, not choosing the awards, but listening in and this type of thing. And really, we invented that whole thing along the way. It was a real nice partnership with TIP, and I can envision something like this in various quantum plus X spaces. But that's where the dialogue with folks from the private sector here can be formalized through workshop, as Erwin said, and we very much welcome that.
So I wish I could keep going with all of the many questions. This was amazing. I would love to go on for another hour, but we have unfortunately run out of time. So please join me in thanking both Dave and Erwin.
Thank you all.